The find happened in the winter of 1871 in a drift mine cut into the hillside above Connellsville in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, where the Pittsburgh seam of bituminous coal ran 8 feet thick through the ridge and had been feeding the region's coke ovens for most of a decade. The miner who made it was a man named Heinrich Krause, a German immigrant who had worked the bituminous country since '67 and knew the seam's behavior well enough to read it by lantern and feel. He was cutting into a fresh face in the 4th drift on the morning of the 19th of November when his pick struck something that did not give like coal and did not ring like rock, a dull, dense contact that experienced colliers learned to stop and examine carefully before doing anything else. He cleared the surrounding material with a short-handled hammer, working outward from the point of impact, careful not to shift the object within the face, and when he had cleared enough to see the whole of it, he set down the hammer and looked. What he was looking at was a rectangular bar of iron, approximately 14 inches long, 1 inch and 3/4 wide, and 3/4 of an inch thick. The bar was not rusted through. It was not deformed by the pressure of the overburden above it. It was straight, its surfaces plainer, its corners showing the dressed geometry that deliberate metalworking produces, rather than any natural accumulation or chemical deposition. The coal surrounding it, on every side, showed no joint, no fracture plane, no intrusion channel through which the bar might have entered the seam from outside. It sat in the coal the way an object sits in material that formed around it, enclosed, not inserted, and the seam that had enclosed it was, by every geological survey of that district produced since the 1840s, older than the human species by a margin that no calendar built around the human record could meaningfully express. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Krause took the bar to the surface and set it at the drift entrance, where several men from the morning shift gathered to look at it before the overseer arrived. The overseer was a man named George Alderton, who had managed this section of the operation for 5 years and handled the find with the kind of measured attention that unusual objects from below ground deserve before anyone decides what to do with them. He examined the bar's weight, its rigidity, the cross-sections where the coal had been cleared from the metal, and wrote to the mining company's superintendent in Uniontown that same week. The superintendent's reply, preserved in summary in the Fayette County Historical Collection, instructed Alderton to forward the bar to a geologist for examination and to mark the precise location of the recovery in the mine's survey logs. Whether those instructions were executed as given cannot be confirmed by any surviving record. What the Uniontown office's quarterly ledger does show is an entry dated the 4th of January 1872, recording that a specimen from the 4th drift had been forwarded to an address in Pittsburgh. The recipient is not named in the entry. No acknowledgement of receipt appears in the correspondence files of the months that follow, and the pages of the ledger covering February and March of 1872 are not there. The paper at the spine of the ledger is intact and continuous. The binding shows no sign of damage. The pages were removed from the ledger at some point between the date of their creation and the last occasion on which someone catalogued what the ledger held, and nothing in the surviving records says when that removal occurred or on whose instruction. The bar appears in the written record again 3 years later, in the private correspondence of Joseph Peter Leslie, appointed Pennsylvania's second state geologist in 1874. Leslie was among the most careful geological observers of his generation. He was not inclined toward speculation and showed no patience in his published work for claims that the physical record did not support. His surveys of Pennsylvania's coal and iron districts, produced across more than 2 decades of systematic fieldwork, described seam partings and clay horizons with a precision that made them the commercial standard for the district long after his death. His papers are held at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and they are comprehensive in the way that the papers of meticulous men tend to be. Among them, in a letter from October of 1876 addressed to a colleague at the Ohio Geological Survey in Columbus, Leslie mentions briefly that he had examined a piece of forged iron said to have been recovered from the Connellsville district and found it anomalous in its geological context. He does not explain what he means by anomalous. He does not indicate whether he had drawn a conclusion or intended to pursue the matter further. The colleagues' reply, if there was one, is not in the collection. And in the 43 volumes of published survey work that followed across the next 20 years, covering every significant coal exposure in Pennsylvania, with systematic detail that extended to the color of individual shale bands above specific seams, the iron bar from the fourth drift at Connellsville does not appear. It is not catalogued as an anomaly examined and explained. It is not mentioned as a specimen received and assessed. It is absent in all forms. Leslie kept field notebooks for every district he surveyed, and those notebooks are as complete as the published volumes. They record roof conditions observed in specific mine entries in 1876 and reference those same conditions again in surveys produced 15 years later. He was a man who wrote down what he observed, systematically and without apparent exception, and the span of what he observed across 2 decades of Pennsylvania fieldwork was wide. For an object he described in his own private correspondence as anomalous in its geological context, to be absent from every notebook entry and every published volume that followed, is not the same as forgetting something. In a record of that completeness, the sustained omission of a single item carries weight that the presence of the item would not have carried in the same proportion. The shape of what Leslie chose not to put on paper is itself a form of evidence. The coal in which Krauss found the bar belongs to a formation whose geological history is well understood and whose age has been confirmed by independent methods across more than a century of scientific investigation. The Pittsburgh Seam underlies southwestern Pennsylvania, the northern panhandle of West Virginia, and portions of eastern Ohio. It formed during what geologists designate the Pennsylvanian period, a subdivision of the Carboniferous, when the interior of the North American continent lay near the equator and was covered by swamp forests of a kind that no living ecosystem resembles. Lycopsid trees rose more than 60 feet from saturated ground, their bark showing the diamond-patterned surface whose fossils appear in the limestone partings of the seam today, identifiable to species by plant paleontologists who study them. Tree ferns arched over the waterlogged floor below them. Corditalian conifers with strap-like leaves pressed their impressions into the mud that became the seam's roof shale. All of it accumulated, layer by layer, and was compressed under hundreds of feet of later rock over millions of years, until what had been a living forest became the dark, pressurized seam that Krauss and thousands of miners before and after him cut with picks and loaded into trams. Radiometric measurements of the organic carbon in the Pittsburgh bed and the volcanic ash bands preserved within it place the seam's formation at between 305 and 315 million years before the present. The bar that Krauss found in an unbroken face of that coal, if the geological context of its recovery was accurately described by every person who saw it in place, was not introduced into the seam after the coal formed. It was enclosed by the coal as the coal itself was being made. In 1882, miners driving a new entry in a shaft mine near Hammondsville in Jefferson County, Ohio, recovered 2 iron bars from a coal face in circumstances described by the engineering inspector sent to examine them in terms that cover much of the same ground as Alderton's description of the Connellsville bar a decade earlier. The inspector was a man named Samuel Hartwell, employed that season by the Ohio Geological Survey to conduct a structural inspection of coal operations in the district. Hartwell's field notes from that survey, a portion of which the survey incorporated into its published annual report for 1883, described the bars as rectangular in cross-section, between 10 and 16 inches in length, and displaying what he called the unmistakable product of hammerwork and furnace heat applied in a controlled sequence. He noted that both bars came from an unbroken coal face, that no joint or fracture plane interrupted the surrounding matrix, and that no channel through the overlying strata could account for their position. These observations appear in the printed annual report. What does not appear there is a paragraph present in Hartwell's manuscript field notes, held by the Ohio Historical Society, in which he asks directly whether the survey intended to investigate the question of how objects bearing the marks of deliberate metalworking could exist within a formation whose depositional age the survey's own published literature had consistently placed in the hundreds of millions of years before any human presence. The paragraph was in the notes Hartwell submitted. It is not in the text the survey printed. No annotation in the published report indicates that a change was made. No letter between Hartwell and the survey's director for that year refers to the omitted paragraph. Hartwell submitted 2 further reports to the Ohio Geological Survey in 1884 and 1885 on ventilation and seam stability in other districts. He resigned from the survey in 1886 and joined a private engineering firm in Cleveland. His professional publications in the decade that followed deal entirely with practical mine engineering, drainage, roof support systems, ventilation measurement. The bars from Hammondsville do not appear under his name in any professional or popular medium after the summer of 1882. Whether the bars themselves were transferred to institutional custody, retained by someone in the chain of examination, or simply lost in the administrative processes of the survey is not answered by any record currently held in the Ohio Historical Society's collection. The third significant case in this sequence came from the coal fields of what was then Indian Territory, in the Choctaw Nation district that would become Latimer County in the state of Oklahoma after statehood in 1907. Miners working a seam for a coal operator near the town of Wilburton in 1912 recovered from an unbroken coal face a cast iron vessel, shaped and cast rather than bar-formed, whose material properties were examined by a metallurgist named Frank Kennard, working in the region at that time. Kennard published his findings in a technical journal in 1914. His account describes a carbon content and grain structure in the iron consistent, by standard metallurgical analysis, with deliberate smelting and controlled casting rather than any natural geological deposition. He states this finding without qualification. He does not speculate about the object's age or origin or purpose. He describes the material, and the material implies a manufacturing process. What that manufacturing process was doing in a coal seam whose formation the Oklahoma Geological Survey's own published literature had placed at approximately 300 million years before the present, is a question Kennard declined to take up, noting that such questions lay outside his technical authority as a metallurgist. No one within whose authority they did fall addressed them in any published record that has come to light. The Oklahoma find is cited in later research more often than the Pennsylvania and Ohio bar finds because Kennard's report reached publication without alteration. The technical description is complete and is readable today in the form he wrote it, but the bar finds predate the Oklahoma case by 4 decades, and what the 3 cases share across 3 states and 3 decades of separate institutional response is a consistency that no single find produces on its own. Worked metal in an intact coal face in each case. Professional examination that generated a partial or interrupted record in each case. The investigator moving subsequently to different work without public acknowledgement of what had been set aside in each case. The institutions involved had no documented connection to each other. The men involved did not know each other's work. The pattern across them is not the result of coordination. It is the result of the same question being asked of different institutions at different times and producing the same response. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Iron does not forge itself. The statement is plain, and the chemistry behind it is not complicated. Wrought iron and bar iron in the rectangular cross-sections described by every witness to these recoveries are products of a specific and well-understood sequence of human operations: ore extraction, smelting in a reduction furnace, reheating to a workable temperature, hammer work to remove slag and orient the metal's grain, and surface dressing to consistent dimension. The oriented grain structure that hammerwork produces is visible under microscopic examination and is distinguishable from the structure of naturally occurring iron formations by any trained metallurgist with a prepared sample. Iron concretions do form naturally within coal seams through chemical precipitation of iron carbonate, and they appear regularly in the geological literature on coal-bearing strata. They are nodular, they are irregular in shape. Their internal structure reflects the process that produced them, with iron compounds distributed in patterns consistent with slow precipitation from solution rather than rapid crystallization from a melt. They do not have flat faces. They do not have dressed corners. They do not maintain consistent cross-sectional dimensions along their length. They do not have the oriented grain structure that hammerwork produces. When Samuel Hartwell described the Hammondsville bars as displaying the unmistakable product of hammerwork and furnace heat, he was applying professional training to observable physical properties. He was not expressing an impression, he was making a technical determination about manufacturing process, and the technical language he used to make it was precise enough that no one in the subsequent literature has challenged the description on metallurgical grounds. The earliest confirmed iron smelting in the human archaeological record is documented in Anatolia and the northern Levant at some point in the second millennium before the Common Era, approximately 3,000 years before the present. The coal seams from which the Pennsylvania and Ohio bars were recovered formed between 305 and 315 million years ago. The gap between those 2 points on the geological calendar is approximately 312 million years. No revision of the dating methods applied to Carboniferous formations, and no revision of the archaeological dating of the earliest known human metallurgy reduces that gap to a number that the existing human timeline can absorb. The gap is not a matter of interpretation. It is a measurement, and the measurement has not meaningfully changed across 150 years of investigation on both sides of it. 3 positions are available to anyone examining this evidence, with both the physical record and the documentary record in front of them. The first is that the geological context of each recovery was misread, that the bars were introduced into the coal seams by post-depositional processes that left no detectable trace in the surrounding matrix, a claim that runs against the testimony of every trained observer who examined the objects in place and against the standard understanding of how post-depositional intrusions behave within coal-bearing strata. The second is that the accounts are collectively fabricated, that Krause, Alderton, Leslie, Hartwell and Kennard, working independently across 4 decades and 3 states and 3 separate institutional structures, each produced a false or distorted record, a claim made considerably harder to sustain by the survival of Leslie's private correspondence in an academic archive, Hartwell's manuscript field notes in a state historical society, and Kennard's published technical account in a professional journal, 3 independent institutional holdings with no documented connection to each other. The third position is that the objects are what the geological context of their recovery indicates. Forged iron enclosed in coal formed 300 million years before the first evidence of human metallurgy anywhere in the historical record. 2 of the 3 positions require the evidence to be wrong. The third requires the timeline to be wrong. None of them is comfortable, and none of them has been subjected to systematic formal investigation by any institution with the resources and the mandate to conduct one. The coal seams of Fayette County, Pennsylvania, and Jefferson County, Ohio, and Latimer County, Oklahoma, were worked commercially across the better part of 2 centuries. The men who cut those seams numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and the institutional apparatus governing their work was oriented entirely toward questions with economic answers: seam thickness, coal quality, production rates, roof behavior, drainage costs. A miner who brought a forged iron bar out of a coal face and showed it to his overseer was performing a human action, the action of showing a strange thing to the nearest person with authority. What happened to the bar after that point depended on whether anyone in the chain between the mine face and the Geological Survey Office had a category for receiving it. The surviving record shows, in 4 separate instances across 4 separate decades, that the institutional category for this kind of evidence was either not available or was actively set aside, and that the men who came nearest to developing it moved to other work in the years that followed without public explanation. Heinrich Krause continued working in the Connellsville district for more than a decade after the winter he found the bar. The Fayette County Directory of 1885 lists him as a collier in the same district, the same occupation 14 years later. No record survives of him speaking publicly about the bar after Alderton's letter to the superintendent in the winter of 1871. No later investigator or geologist sought him out, so far as the surviving correspondence shows. No return visit to the fourth drift for the purpose of examining the surrounding coal is documented in any mine survey or inspection report from the years that followed the find. He went back underground and cut more coal, and the seam continued in both directions from the face where his pick had struck metal. 310 million years of compressed forest running through the ridge, and whatever the undisturbed sections of it might still contain, lay in the dark as it had for 300 million years before he arrived. The Pittsburgh seam is still in the ground. So are the coal measures of Jefferson County, Ohio, and the formations of Latimer County, Oklahoma. The portions of those beds that no 19th century mine reached, lying below the depths of the old drift and shaft operations, remain intact and unexamined by any instrument directed at the specific question the bar finds raised. Ground-penetrating radar, isotopic analysis of metal alloy composition, systematic sampling of unmined seam faces at the depths where the bar finds occurred. None of these have been applied to this question by any institution that has published its results. The technology to conduct such an investigation has existed for decades. The formations that would need to be investigated have not moved. The question has simply never been formally directed at the institutions best equipped to answer it, or not in any public record that has yet come to light. The bar that Krause brought out of the fourth drift in November of 1871 is not in any public collection today. It was forwarded from the Uniontown Superintendent's office to an address in Pittsburgh in January of 1872, and the ledger pages covering the months that followed that transaction are gone from the binding. An object described in terms consistent with the Connellsville bar appears in the estate inventory of a private collector in Uniontown who died in 1931, listed as an iron piece of unusual provenance recovered from coal. Its current location is not on any public record. It may still exist. It may be sitting in someone's possession with no surviving documentation of what it is or where it came from. What does remain in the record is the coal and the seams, and the geological formations that give both of them their age, and the chain of documentary evidence stretching from Krause's pick striking metal in the fourth drift in 1871, to the partial entry in the Uniontown ledger, to the 2 sentences in Leslie's October letter, to the paragraph removed from Hartwell's annual report before it reached print. 4 separate moments in 4 separate decades, 4 separate men in 4 separate positions in institutions that had no connection to each other, each one arriving at the same point in the evidence, and each one leaving behind a record that stops just short of where the argument was leading. The record stops at the same point in every case, which is the point where the conclusion the physical evidence was building toward required something to be stated in writing that no institution in a position to publish it was prepared to state. Not because the men involved could not follow the argument to its end, the record is legible enough to show they followed it precisely. They followed it, and they stopped. The seam is still down there, the question is still in it, and the bars have not been accounted for. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.